Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay in Lagos, southwest Nigeria. The headlines. Group of 7 leaders here hold their first plenary session today in the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Ukrainian army video purports to show Ukrainian forces attacking Russians near Bakhmut. Plus, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says Moscow, despite grain deal renewal, does not see progress. Thank you for joining us again this morning. Ukrainian military have said that Ukrainian air defense repelled another Russian air attack in the early hours of today, destroying 19 drones and missiles out of 28 launched. Ukrainian Air Force spokesperson Yuri Inhat says shelling continues on an almost daily basis. Not all targets were hit. Russia has increased the number of missile and drone attacks this month, which Kyiv attributes to Moscow's fear of an expected Ukrainian counteroffensive. However, Ukrainian authorities did not report hits on critical infrastructure or military facilities. Colonel General Alexander Syrski, commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, released a video said to show Ukrainian forces attacking and destroying Russian units near Bakhmut. Now, captioned to a video posted in Telegram messaging app, said it shows activities by the 225th Kharkiv Battalion in Bakhmut area. Ukraine's military said it had made new territorial gains in heavy fighting around the eastern city of Bakhmut, despite being outgunned and outnumbered by Russian forces. In the past week, Kyiv has said it has stepped up pressure on Moscow's troops to the north and the south of Bakhmut. Ukrainian officials have signaled that the advances around Bakhmut are not part of a broader counteroffensive plan by Kyiv to push back the Russian forces. Meanwhile, Russian troops are pounding supply lines near the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut to try to halt advances by Ukraine's military. That's according to soldiers near the front line. Petro Padaru, the unit's commander, said, for the most part, as we've started to advance, the Russians are shelling all the routes to the front positions, so our armored vehicles can't deliver more infantry, more ammunition, and other things. Moscow sees Bakhmut, a city of about 70,000, before Russia's full-scale invasion nearly 15 months ago, as a possible stepping stone towards capturing the rest of the eastern Donbass region. Russia's Wagner mercenary group, which is spearheading the Russian assault in the area, says it has moved forward inside the city, and Kyiv has acknowledged those small gains. In the meantime, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelinski has set up an advisory council to restore Ukrainian rule over Russia-annexed Crimea, saying the work to liberate that peninsula was ongoing amidst expectations of Kyiv's counteroffensive. Mr. Zelinski said that more and more countries realize it's impossible to restore justice without returning Crimea, seized and annexed by Russia in 2014. Russia shows no sign of abandoning Crimea, home to the Black Sea Fleet, and has used the peninsula as a platform to launch missile strikes on Ukrainian targets. Mr. Zelinski and other officials held a minute's silence to remember victims of the 1994 deportation of some 200,000 Crimean Tatars to Siberia and Central Asia under the orders of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. However, Moscow has denied accusations of human rights abuse in Crimea and says a referendum held after Russian forces seized the peninsula 9 years ago showed Crimeans genuinely want to be part of Russia. Now, the group of 7 leaders held their plenary session today in the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The three-day gathering, ending on Sunday, is expected to see leaders debate strategy on the more than year-long conflict in Ukraine and other global issues. Earlier today, the leaders visited the Peace Memorial in the city leveled by an atomic bomb in the World War II. The G7 comprises Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United States. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelinski will travel in person to Japan for the Group of Seven summit. That's according to an official familiar with the planning. The war in Ukraine is at the top of the agenda for the three-day summit, where leaders are expected to make a strong statement of unity in support of Ukraine and unveil new measures to choke off Russia's ability to fund and supply its war. Zelinski's expected visit will be his first to Asia since Moscow launched its full-scale assault on Ukraine last February, and comes as Kyiv continues to look to its Western partners for military backing ahead of the highly anticipated counteroffensive. The Ukrainian president's expected travel to Asia follows a four-country European tour, where he welcomed additional pledges of military support for Kyiv's defenses. Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs yesterday had said Mr. Zelinski will participate virtually in the Sunday session of the G7 after being invited by the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida earlier this year. Meanwhile, European Council President Charles Michel said that it was in the European EU's interest to maintain a stable and constructive cooperation with China. Speaking on the sidelines of the Group of Seven Leaders Summit in Japan's Hiroshima city, Mr. Michel added that the EU would call on China to step up pressure on Russia to stop its military aggression.
Do you expect G7 to raise the instrument of sanctions?
Was to be part of the final communique, especially from...
We are now focused on shutting the door on loopholes and continuing to cut Russia off from critical supplies. We will restrict trade in Russian diamonds. Russian diamonds are not forever. And we will lay out openly and frankly why these sanctions are necessary and justified. And constructive relations with China is in our mutual interest. The EU is firm on our values. We will keep voicing our concerns on human rights, whether it is in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, or in Tibet. We also need to engage together with China on global challenges, climate change, conservation of natural resources, biodiversity, debt sustainability. Given its role in the international community and the size of its economy, China has a special responsibility in the world. It has to play by international rules, and we call on China to press Russia to stop its military aggression. There are ties between Russia and Iran. It's not a secret for all of us, but we intend to maximize our diplomatic efforts and to use the different leverage we have in order to convince Iran not to take wrong decisions with regard with this possible support for Russia.
A Senate aide and a defense official has said the Pentagon overvalued its equipment it sent to Ukraine by around $3 billion, an error that opens up the possibility of more weapons being sent to Kyiv for its defense against Russian forces. Two senior defense officials say the error was the result of assigning a higher than warranted value on weaponry that was taken from U.S. stock and then shipped to Ukraine. One of the senior defense officials said, in his words, "We've discovered inconsistencies in how we value the equipment that we've given to Ukraine." The officials and the Senate aide spoke on the condition of anonymity. The defense official said it's possible the amount of overvalued weaponry could grow as the Pentagon examines the situation more thoroughly, increasing the $3 billion. Norway donating F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine is not on the agenda at the moment. That's according to the country's defense minister, John Ariel Graham. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelinski said he was making progress in persuading the West to supply Ukraine with fighter jets, with US-built F-16s flown by several NATO nations in particular focus. However, Western governments have been wary of leaving their own countries undefended by giving away too much equipment. They have also avoided sending anything that could strike deep into Russian territory and give Moscow a reason to escalate the war.
F-16, I really don't want, it's not on the agenda now, and I really don't want to speculate in any possible future donations.
On the Storm Shadow, all I can say is it is my understanding that it has been used since we announced its deployment to Ukraine, but I'm not going to give any further details of that operationally.
The sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines last year is a clear reminder of what is at stake here. Our signing today is therefore very important. By working together, we can improve our abilities to detect submarines, counter mine threats, and to protect critical infrastructure on the seabed.
Now let's talk to Mr. Tony Agbans, researcher, senior lecturer, Anglo-Ruskin University in London. You're welcome to the program.
Yeah, good morning, Olumide.
August 6th and 9th, 1945, a day that will live in infamy for the Japanese people, whether you're of Hiroshima extraction, whether you lived in Nagasaki or had relatives there. These stories have been told, the experiences have been recounted, and the impact is still there in those cities because of the dropping of the atom bomb on both locations back then. Now, that is also the location of this G7 summit, where the attendees, France, Germany, Canada, reads like a roll call of hardline anti-Russian sentiments nations who have taken that position. Now, it's interesting that leading to this meeting, it's just been about sanctions, 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 and no mediation. Could you begin by telling us what your impression of how this G7 summit will impact this conflict?
Thank you, Olumide, for that question. In fact, when you look at, the global geopolitical order, what we can always perceive is the fact that there are no permanent enemies. Like you have rightly situated, that this meeting is holding in Hiroshima, has great historical, significance, considering that was one of the two locations that the Americans dropped the atomic bomb, the nuclear bomb in 1945, an event that, ended the Second World War. So, but ever since, relationship between Japan and the US have healed, and the two nations have been, working together. So, talking specifically about the G7 meeting that is holding in Japan this weekend, it is a very huge meeting considering the crisis in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine at the moment. So, and like you have said, we just hope that it gets to this stage where, world leaders begin to think of resolution and not just weaponry, support for weapons, and all the, bragging and all the use of military force. We are bait, because today makes it 450 days exactly that this Russian invasion of Ukraine began in February. We look back to February 2022. So we just hope, but people of good conscience, people with humanity, just hope that this carnage, currently going on in Ukraine now, will stop. So that is the point where issues are at the moment.
Yes, Mr. Agbans, you can accuse President Vladimir Putin of many things, but maybe stupidity is not one of them. There's a reason why he was continually bringing up the scare tactic threats of using nuclear weapons, deploying nuclear weapons, whether he was going to make good on that evil promise is another thing entirely. But are the nations acting in such a responsible way as to make sure that that is totally taken off the table? It's not a Scud missile, it's not a cluster bomb, it's not a firearm, it's a nuclear weapon, whether it's atomic or hydrogen or any other thing that they're doing nowadays.
Look, Olumide, to be honest, the more this crisis linger on, the higher the probability that nuclear weapons may be deployed. At the end of the day, what are these weapons there for? So, you see, for Russia, who are the aggressor in this particular instance, for whatever reason that they may have, that is personal to them. That is, look, the Russian president, except, a neutral negotiator comes into this, and this is where I'll talk about that later. Pope Francis has been doing a lot in that regard. It will get to a stage where the nuclear weapons may be deployed, and it's most likely going to come from the Russian side because they have it. We have seen drills, in Belarus, where the Russians have, have some drills and all that. So, but this is doomsday kind of thing, and the Russians have also threatened that, especially when Britain early this year supplied some accessories which contained, a nuclear radioactive material, Ethereum. The Russians threatened that, that the UK was escalating the crisis. So we never know, because the way this crisis is going is a case of the more you look, the less you see. But let's we wait and see what the G7 leaders will come up with. Yes. I feel very, very deflated that the United Nations have not done much in resolving this crisis.
Yes, it's quite clear, Mr. Agbans, that it appears they're calling his bluff. And as you say, you're quite correct. It's a doomsday scenario. It's Armageddon. It's end of the world type thing. But we hope it doesn't get to that point. Now, there's an interesting development where President Zelinski, and I think this is a show of confidence on his part, you'll let me know if I'm wrong, that he's setting up a committee or an advisory council on restoring Crimea to Ukraine. This is as the war is still undecided and the counteroffensive is still being expected. The posture of Ukraine at this moment, what are your thoughts? I saw that report, and for me, it's just a confident booster that Mr. Zelinski, he's got a lot of support. In the last few days, he's been all over the place. He's been to some Scandinavian countries. He visited Germany. He was well received. He made a stop by here in the UK. And on the feed, we saw some of the things that were happening. The Wagner group, that mercenary group that is supporting Russia, there have been some issues there. The Russians themselves are not having it their way on the battlefield with regards to the boots that they have on the ground. Weariness is coming in from both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. So I think, this is just my personal perception, I think that President Zelinski is, constituting this council, for Crimea, is just to boost confidence and motivate and inspire his people. Like you and I know, Russia still called the shot in that region of, Ukraine, which they annexed way back in 2013. If you're going to take Crimea, you'd better back it up with a whole lot of, with a whole lot of power and punch, because the Russians, it appears, they don't seem to be thinking in that direction at all. But that's still a whole way down the road. As far as aid is concerned, the United States have said, as we've just reported this morning, that they undervalued the aid that they've sent to Ukraine in a certain area, and now they're going to be able to even send more aid to Ukraine because of this. As all these countries continue to send aid to Ukraine, as they send the weapons, as they send the money, as they send the support, what's your impression of how these items will be put to use to defend themselves against Russia?
Yeah, very well. They will be put, this military hardware and weapons will be put to use. You saw what happened a few days ago, the missile and drone attacks from Russia, and the Ukrainians were able to take about 6 of them down in Kyiv. So that's the power of, of military weaponry. So most of these were supplied by the UK and the Americans. So, in fact, with the valuation and devaluation scenario, I think it's a win-win for the Ukrainians. So the Americans, like you have said, will be able to supply more weapons. They are in discussion with the Dutch. They are going to supply them weapons, F-16 fighters, Norway, Denmark. I think the support from the UK have also sent a lot of weapons as well. But the only snag that most of us see as we have to look at this crisis is for how long is the Americans, the British, Germans, and the other European Union countries and NATO, for how long are they going to continue to support Ukraine with weapons? For how long are they going to be spending their resources, their financial resources, and human resources to support Ukraine? Like they train the Ukrainian soldiers in the use of some of this equipment, because these things have a back effect on the economies of these nations. So because prosecuting a war takes a lot of financial resources.
NATO have answered that question, sir. They've said that they're thinking of a multi-year approach to support Ukraine militarily. So NATO is certainly not the people to go to if you're talking about mediation. They're looking years down the line, and it's just something that's very scary, to say the least. And recently, the talk of the town is the F-16 fighter jets that have been proposed by the British and the Dutch, to which Norway, as we just reported this morning, have said, no, we're not looking in that direction. These, obviously, you want to take a closer look at these planes, these military planes that are going to be used if it does turn out that they do get F-16 fighter jets. I know they're highly maneuverable. They do surface to air. They do, air to air and air to surface attacks, and they're very expensive and they're quite sophisticated. And it will also bring a whole new dimension to this war. And it's also putting Russia in a position where they will send a strong message if all these items, including the F-16, get delivered to Ukraine. Not that they shouldn't get delivered, but where do you think countries who are now more neutral than these other ones should stand to make more concerted efforts to bring both sides to the negotiating table? And which countries do you think can have, at this moment, that same type of influence?
Before I answer your question, let me just quickly chip in that Norway, they are reluctant to send F-16 jet, but I think the talks with the Dutch, is progressing a bit further. But if Norway doesn't, there are other nations that will supply. Let's not forget that during war, like a war situation like this, businesses also thrive. This is one of the negative stroke positive side of war. Businesses thrive. So these things are not just really free when we look at it economically. So to your question, direct, NATO is not the go-to table for negotiations, because there will probably be, there is bias already. But I think Pope Francis, the pontiff, has been doing a lot. As I speak to you, he has sent emissaries. I think he sent the Bishop of Bologna to meet with President Zelinski. And then he sent another Vatican official, senior ranking official of the Vatican, to meet with President Putin. And there have been really positive feedback from both sides. So the Pope is doing a lot, and God bless him for that. Then, this week as well, some African countries, they are sending a delegation on a peace mission. Whether they will have the leverage to, do that, that is also ongoing. The Brazilian president has made effort, but is obviously has been said that he's, siding with Russia. The same applies to China, who have also made overtures in the past. So, but the more likely dispute resolution is going to come from Pope Francis. He's been doing a lot, and we hope that flies through.
What about the Africans? What about African leaders? There's been talk recently, yesterday, the day before, of an African peace mission.
Yeah, that's what I said. But I don't really know the African nations. Report have said some African nations, but I believe that probably South Africa, maybe Nigeria, Egypt, the top Kenya, top African nations from different corners of the continent. But I know that a lot of people are skeptical that if South Africa is in that group, they will be biased because, South Africa belongs to that BRIC bloc of nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They have that economic bloc within them. But for me, any effort towards resolving this crisis should be encouraged, and we will just see and hope that both the Russian and the Ukrainian side, they will, take a back seat and know that something has to give, because in negotiation, you win some and you lose some. It's a kind of 50-50 scenario.
Nations apart from the ones you've just mentioned, even farther afield, have expressed an interest. One surprising is Saudi Arabia, who've extended some sort of invitation to Zelinski. Do you think Saudi Arabia have any role to play?
Oh, absolutely. They are one of the big boys when it comes to the world economic order. Saudi Arabia, yes, they too have been playing a huge role. Remember, and Turkey as well. They call themselves Turkey now. They've been also doing a lot of behind-the-scenes work. You saw this week that the grain deal has been extended by another 2 months, even when everyone thought that there was not going to be an extension, because Russia have said their own export is suffering, so they are not going to allow the Black Sea to be used, and the channels for the logistics, they're going to close it. But it's been extended. So Turkey and Saudi Arabia too have also been playing a huge role. So there's a lot of negotiations going on behind the scene. And I must say, because I live here in the UK, the British Prime Minister too, who is he's new to world politics and all that goes on in diplomatic circle, he's also be pulling some strings. I'm aware of that. So we hope that all these efforts will come together, and then the Russians and the Ukrainians can be brought to the negotiating table. That has not happened for many months now. And we, international observers and keen observers, believe that should be happening, because this battle is not going to be won on the field. It's going to end on the negotiating table.
If we've learned anything in the last few months, it seems to be that the sanctions against Russia is like water off a duck's back. They seem not to be working. Whether you're targeting the oligarchs, whether you're squeezing their financials, whatever it is you seem to be doing, the Russians seem to find a way to keep afloat and to keep prosecuting this war. Is there anything the West or the allies of Ukraine are missing?
It is really surprising. People don't really understand how Russia has been able to survive the huge sanctions, and it doesn't seem to be having any effect on them. So for me, I just think that what the West should do is to talk. I think it's to talk. So all this grandstanding and show of force obviously has no faith. And let's not forget that when you look at Russia, they are one of the superpowers in the world. So if you look at it militarily, I don't think Russia will ever lose the war. This is my opinion. They won't, because they are a superpower. It's like saying that the US they go to battle and they lose. It's not going to happen. So what I think the West should do is to talk. So in any way they do that, whether via proxies, because they may be too, it may feel like a disgrace. They may not want to do it themselves. They have to find an avenue to talk. That is just what I would say on that question.
Thank you, Mr. Agbans. If Russia doesn't lose the war, a worst-case scenario is if it becomes another Vietnam, another Afghanistan, another situation that just continues to defy a solution. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, Mr. Tony Agbans, researcher, senior lecturer at Anglia Ruskin University in London.
Thank you, Olumide. Have a great day.
You too. After the break, United Nations says 3 new ships approved for Black Sea grain deal. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. The United Nations says 3 new ships have been authorized to take part in the deal allowing the safe Black Sea export of Ukraine grain as global wheat prices fell further a day after Russia agreed to extend the pact for 60 more days. Russia threatened to quit the Black Sea grain initiative if a list of demands to overcome obstacles to its own grain and fertilizer exports was not met by May the 18th. The Kremlin said it had extended the agreement because some results from talks had given it certain hope, but more progress needed to be made. UN Deputy Spokesperson Farhan Haq said the Black Sea Grain Initiative Joint Coordination Center authorized 3 new vessels to travel to the Ukrainian ports of Odessa and Chernomorsk. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that Moscow had agreed to renew the Black Sea grain deal for 2 months, even though it did not see results when it comes to implementing the parts of it which apply to Russia. Speaking at a press conference with his Ugandan counterpart, Mr. Lavrov says the deal was aimed at bolstering the food security of the world's poorest people. Lavrov denied that Russia's renewal of the part Turkish brokered deal was related to presidential elections in Turkey. The sourcing and flow of weapons on both sides of the war in Ukraine was on the agenda on Thursday's session at the United Nations Security Council. Council representatives pointed fingers towards the parties they deemed responsible for the continued aggression as the deputy to the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Adedeji Ebo, updated the number of civilian casualties to at least 23,821 since Russia invaded in February 2022. The council session took place against the backdrop of a new package of sanctions announced by the United States and the rest of the group of 7 major economies.
24 February 2022. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 23,821 civilian casualties in Ukraine. 8,836 killed and 14,985 injured, with the actual figures likely to be considerably higher. Most of the civilian deaths and injuries continue to be caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects, including attacks by heavy artillery, tanks, multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, and airstrikes.
Using Ukraine as a testing ground to drag out the conflict to the last Ukrainian in an effort to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. This is based on the obvious desire to continue to dictate their will and their so-called rules to everyone. Billions of dollars are spent pumping weapons into Ukraine from the pockets of taxpayers, which flow into the accounts of the Western military-industrial complex.
Ukraine will continue to exercise its right of self-defense in strict accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. We will continue to fight until every Ukrainian citizen and every parcel of our sovereign land are liberated and Russia suffers military defeat in Ukraine.
The provision of weapons for Ukraine's territorial defense is not extending or exacerbating this conflict. Rather, these arms help repel Russia's invasion of its neighbor and prevent an even further invasion of Ukraine's sovereign territory. These arms shipments help prevent Russia from further brutalizing Ukraine civilians, forcing them from their homes, and driving up energy and food costs across Europe and around the world.
Russia sources weapons for Putin's illegal war from states such as Iran and DPRK, in blatant violation of relevant Security Council resolutions. The UK calls on other states not to provide Russia with military assistance. The cost of this war is felt around the world. Its impact on food and commodity prices is severe. We welcome the continuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and call on Russia not to hold up the movement of ships under the deal as a pressure tactic.
Poorly managed weapons, stockpiles, and supplies can be diverted to terrorist groups or other malign actors. It is critical to guard against such risks. We have seen how illicit weapons transfers to such groups were behind the proliferation of violence and numerous attacks against civilians and undermined the security and stability of many states. We underline, therefore, the importance of appropriate management of weapons during transfer, storage, and deployment.
When we return, more than 200 Russian athletes sanctioned following the Operation Limbs investigation into Moscow's anti-doping laboratory. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. And as the program continues, we'd like to turn our attention to how the business world is affected by this conflict. Ini John Mekwa, our business correspondent, is with us. Ini, it's good to see you again this morning.
Yeah.
Now, the number of those displaced by this Russian invasion of Ukraine has far exceeded 8 million. That's a conservative figure. Some say as high as 10 million and even more. But for those who have fled to Finland, who are Russian, right, trying to avoid mobilization and the conscription and what have you, now that the country is waiting for the instruction on what to do to them, how is that affecting employment, labor, and business in Russia? People, are they leaving their jobs and abandoning their, or are these people who are not working? Are these What's the demographic?
So it's mostly young men, as we've seen in many reports, because I think it got to an extent they went to the prisons, and those who were in prison, especially the young men, had to be conscripted into to go and fight the war. And a lot of people are trying to avoid this. I remember one video that hardly leaves my mind, a long train of cars driving out of Russia because they did not want to be part of the war, you know, and so they found themselves in countries like Finland. So far, it's recorded that about 1,000 Russians have fled Finland to avoid that. And obviously, Finland is having this intake, but I do remember also that there were talks of visa. Finland and some other European countries, even though they enjoy, because most of the people leaving Russia seem to be the middle class. And for instance, so they go to these other countries, Finland in this instance. So they can afford it? Yeah, they go there and then they create their own middle class. What that does is it displaces the middle class that was already in existence. Oh. Because, Russia... these guys, they have the money, you know, and they're ready to spend on real estate for one. So it has made the cost of housing, accommodation, more expensive in some of these countries, in Finland and some of these countries that Russians have fled to. And then they have created their own middle class and sort of displaced, because, someone owns a house or somebody wants to sell a house and it's up for 1,000 rubles. And then there's somebody who comes and says, don't worry, I'll give you 1,200 rubles. And then the guy who is from Finland doesn't have that extra income. But because these guys are desperate, they've come with a lot of money from their country, which they have been saving up, you know, so they're taking up this. So in the short run, it made life a bit difficult for especially the middle class in some of these countries like Finland. But in the long run, of course, because obviously this is more population, this is more energy to be spent, this is more people on the road. This, you know, in the long run, some of these countries are beginning to think or rethink of the impact on their economy, because they will also need jobs. When they have brought in the money that they have brought and they spent it in the country, they're not going to live on that money forever. You know, it's going to get to an end. So even if they invest, you understand, they're going to put the money in invest and they're going to look for ways to also replenish for them to be able to sustain their living in those countries. So these are some of the things that countries like Finland have had to balance since we see a lot of Russians, because of course there are Russians that are not in support of the war. Yeah. Or, you know, even if they're in support of the war, they don't want to be the ones to fight the war, you know, and so they leave the country. And then to your first question, which is what is it doing to Russia? Obviously, we've talked about, we have the GDP of Russia last year, 2021, which was released last year, it dropped by 2.1%. Now, for the first quarter of this year, it's down by 1.9%. I mean, that's better, a bit better than what it was last year, but it's still a drop in their GDP. Their oil revenues have dropped by 43%, you know, and all of that. And we've talked about how they're trying to collaborate with India, especially to get some of those tech individuals or companies running, because the West used to be majorly responsible for their aviation, for their ICT, both the software and the hardware, you know. And with these individuals leaving Russia, perhaps these are the brains that should have continued, but they're leaving. There are a lot of gaps, you know, in the ICT and all of that. But, I mean, we've also seen the government, that's Russian government, spend a lot. I mean, for them to for their GDP to drop by just 1.9%. There's a lot of spending going on by the government. We've heard of funds being created to boost the aviation, to boost the automobile, to boost small businesses. The government of Russia is spending a whole lot, you know, to sustain the economy and put it at where it is. And that's why some people, as some analysts, are saying that it's artificial. We've seen the ruble still has a lot of value and things like that. You know, it might be artificial because it's getting a lot of support from the government. The only applause that the government gets is that, well, in spite of all of the sanctions, in spite of the price cap, in spite of Europe winning itself off Russian oil and gas and things like that, you still have them making as much money as they are making, even from oil and gas. They also have aluminum. They have, all of those resources that they have developed, and they're still earning from it. And that's what is sustaining the government, even though you would say that the government is giving a lot of buffer to the sectors of the economy, and that's why you would even see maybe one of their biggest banks, Spare Bank, they just declared profits, But there's a lot of intelligence, a lot of hard decisions which the government has to make, which the central bank has to make to sustain the economy at the stage that we see now, that, people will still question, is the sanction really having enough impact on it? Because there's a lot of ingenuity that seems to be going on to managing the Russian economy at this time, which is why, in spite of all of the sanctions, you still see the GDP is dropping by 2.1% and things like that.
So the exodus of the Russians from their country to Finland, I think it's important to mention that Russia has a scheme where at a certain age you have to serve in the military.
Yeah.
So even
I think that's like the NYSC that we have here in Nigeria. Yeah.
Of that nature. And so even pre the Ukraine invasion, this was the de rigueur. It was a thing that has to happen, and it's a thing of shame if you are seen to dodge it in any way in Russia.
This is not.
So
this is not it.
This is dodging.
This is not it.
It's almost the same thing. They're dodging the draft. They don't want to be sent to war.
Well, they don't want to support the war.
Okay, so they have deep pockets. So they take it to Finland, and then the Finnish people say,
I guess
welcome.
mean, whether they are Russians or non-Russians, I guess at the end of the day, people have the right to choose which side they want to be on. Because my president believes this is right doesn't mean I should, support that. So if I think that if my President Putin is my president, and I think his action or decision to invade Ukraine is wrong, even though they do have their reasons, and protecting their territory and all of that. But if I personally believe, I don't believe in that course, then, people, and that's why there's the right of immigration. You can move to other countries. Even as harsh as it is, you still have the UK giving opportunity to Russians who can invest a certain level of investment becoming residents, in some other European countries. So, that's the global rule. That's the rule of life. People should be able to take their decisions. If you can pay for the price that is required, then it's all yours. You take it. Doesn't matter what. People
Understood.
go against their parents. Then
understood. But this is a wartime situation. Thank you, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
Ini John Mekwa. Now, finally on the program. Well, I understand we do have our guest with us at this point. Mr. Vince Onyekwelu, National Security Risk Strategist and former British police officer. Good morning to you.
Good morning. How are you doing? Morning.
Now, let's talk about the F-16 fighter jets that have been proposed to be sent to to Ukraine by the countries who intend to do so. Now, I don't know what sort of plane Tom Cruise was using in the Top Gun film Maverick, but it's that sort of maneuverability that the F-16 fighter jets have. And we saw at the United Nations where Russia was saying that, they're using Ukraine as a test case, as a dumping ground for their weapons, and this will just escalate the war. The UK and the US have a different view. Should countries send F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense, any country which to send F-16 or even F-35 to Ukraine, it's their prerogative. They have every right to do so if they feel in their conscience That's fair enough. On the other side, it's no, because the dangers of the no is if any of those high-tech technologies were to be captured by the Russians, what they would do is to download the prototype, download the technical framework, and understand the kind of system they are using, if it's a Red Hat system or if it's any other kind of new technology or new application. And that makes the F-16 or the F-35 more vulnerable. Don't forget, most of these F-16 or F-35 were not just built with USA technology. Obviously, once as a young officer, I used to go and cover what you call air shows. Air shows is where the world technology aeroplanes are brought together in a kind of airfield show. Using the latest jet fighters, the ones that already not need to run in a runway takeoff, they can just take off like helicopters nowadays. And these technologies are not only owned by one country. You'll be surprised that some of the wings may be from France, the engine technology may come from Germany, the landing technology may come from the USA. So it's all multi international technology that comes together to build most of these new jet fighters. So if it falls in the hands of the Russians, for example, if it gets to be shut down by the Russians, the fact is all this secrecy, all this ingenuity will be harnessed and used by the Russians for future warfare. Is it worth it? We are talking about taxpayers' money. And also, don't forget, most of these countries like the USA will be going to general elections in 2024. The same thing with the UK, Germany, France. So obviously, by
Thank
the
you,
end
Mr.
of the year,
Onyekwelu. We'll just have to leave it there. We'll be looking forward to bring you on the program on another occasion. But thank you. Whether it's a stealth bomber, F-16, amphibious, or a combat helicopter, both sides have no weapons. Both sides can fight. Thank you for coming on the program today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And finally, on the program, the World Anti-Doping Agency said more than 200 Russian athletes have been sanctioned following the Operation LIMS investigation into Moscow's anti-doping laboratory, with more bans to come. The suspensions are the result of data and samples retrieved by WADA's intelligence and investigations team into the Moscow Laboratory Information Management System. A total of 203 Russian athletes have been sanctioned by 17 anti-doping organizations, with an additional 73 charged. Another 182 cases remain under investigation. In 2015, the Russian Anti-Doping Agency declared non-compliance with its WADA code after an investigation uncovered widespread institutionalized doping. And that's where we leave it for this special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you so much for watching. Do join us again next week. Have a great weekend.